The Valorian Dominion had not lost a war in 11,000 years, and High Fleet Marshal Threxin Vaol intended to keep that record intact for another 11,000 more. He stood upon the command dais of the Dreadnought Eternal Ascendancy, a vessel so vast that its shadow alone could blot out a moon, and he watched the tactical display bloom before him like a flower of pure conquest. 741 warships hung in staggered formation behind his flagship, their hulls the color of dried blood and burnished bronze, each one etched with the sigils of 1,000 subjugated species. The Dominion did not build ships so much as it built monuments to inevitability, and the fleet now gliding toward the outer marker buoys of a nothing little system called Kepler-Verdance was, by Threxin's own estimation, overkill of a magnitude that bordered on insulting to his own reputation. He had asked for this posting personally, not because the target mattered, it did not, but because the Dominion's Central Intelligence Cortex had flagged the system with a designation so laughably low that Threxin had laughed aloud in the war room when he first read it. Class 5 Minimal Threat, the lowest tier the Cortex bothered to assign to any species with functioning starflight. Beneath the Scan, who had folded in 4 hours. Beneath the Ashtonari, who had folded in 4 minutes. The humans of Kepler-Verdance, according to 11 years of passive orbital surveillance, 3 infiltrated data relays, and a captured freighter's flight logs, possessed exactly 1 system defense cruiser of note, a scattering of unarmed civilian trade vessels, some agricultural drone hardware repurposed as makeshift point defense, and a population of 600,000 colonists who spent most of their broadcast bandwidth arguing about crop rotations and a local sport involving a ball and 18 fielders. There was, the report noted almost apologetically, no evidence of any capital-grade shipyard, no orbital fortification of consequence, and no military doctrine beyond what could charitably be called reactive militia posture. Threxin had brought 741 warships to conquer 600,000 farmers. It was not caution, it was theater. The Valorian Dominion did not merely conquer, it performed conquest, broadcasting the surrender of every world back through its propaganda relays to remind the 11,000 subject species under its yoke that resistance was not merely futile but aesthetically embarrassing. Threxin wanted this to be fast, clean, and above all, recorded, a bloodless little parable he could feed to the newly restless client species in the Thren expanse who had begun making noises about autonomy. Look, he would say, look how easily we take what we want. Look how the humans, who thought themselves clever enough to hide behind a gas giant and a handful of orbital relay stations, folded the moment we arrived in force. It would be, he thought, a lovely little morality play. He had already drafted the surrender terms. He had already selected the honor guard for the ceremonial planetfall. He had, if he was honest with himself, already begun composing the victory address in his head, weighing which of his customary turns of phrase would land best with the Cortex sensors back home. The fleet crossed the outer marker at a comfortable 2% of light speed, arrayed in the Dominion's classic radiant lotus formation, a broad, blooming crescent of capital ships with the smaller escort classes nested inside like seeds, all of it centered on the colossal bulk of the Eternal Ascendancy itself. 4 kilometers of armored spine bristling with 300 heavy plasma emitters, and a main gun capable of rendering a moon-sized asteroid into gravel with a single discharge. Behind the Dreadnought came the 2 battlecruiser squadrons, the Wrath of Carnos and the Undying Testament, each nearly as long as the flagship, though narrower, sleeker, built for the killing runs. The Dreadnought was too dignified to bother with. Behind them, the destroyer screens, 96 hulls strong, and behind those the troop transports, 40 of them, packed with 200,000 ground pacification soldiers who Threxin privately suspected would spend this entire campaign playing dice in their barracks bays because there would be nothing here worth pacifying by force. The humans, according to every scrap of intelligence the Cortex had gathered, would see this fleet, calculate the odds, and capitulate within the hour. That was simply what Class 5 species did. It was, in the Dominion's 11,000-year experience, a law of nature nearly as reliable as gravity. Vice Commander Ithara Nal, Threxin's second and the Ascendancy's tactical officer, stood at the secondary console with her 4 eyes tracking 4 separate data feeds at once, a Valorian gift that made her exceptional at her post and insufferable at diplomatic functions. HFY had served under Threxin for 30 years, through the subjugation of the Ferric cluster and the burning of the Chorvain rebellion, and in all that time she had developed exactly one professional habit that Threxin found genuinely useful. She was paranoid in a way that irritated everyone, including herself. The colony's defense grid is transmitting its usual civilian traffic, she reported, her mandibles clicking in the Valorian equivalent of a shrug. Orbital relay platforms, weather monitoring satellites, and agricultural coordination network, nothing that registers above baseline on any weapon's signature scan. It matches the 11-year survey almost exactly. Almost exactly, Threxin repeated, savoring the phrase the way he savored good wine. Ithara, you say that as though it troubles you. Everything troubles me, Marshal. It is why I am still alive. She said it without humor because Valorians did not really understand humor so much as they understood irony, and even that only academically. There is a single warship holding position at the inner defense perimeter. Human registry designation Aegis-class cruiser matches the one vessel of note from the survey. It has not moved. It has not powered weapons. It is, as far as our sensors can determine, simply sitting there. Waiting to surrender it, no doubt, Threxin said. Perhaps they intend to hand us the keys personally. How touching. Far below the drifting bulk of the Dominion fleet, past the shimmering amber bands of the gas giant Calliope Prime that dominated the system's mid-orbit like a vast sleeping eye, and past the rust-red curve of the colony world itself, a very different kind of theater was already 3 years into rehearsal. The single Aegis-class cruiser holding position at the perimeter was named the ISS Cold Harbor, and it was in fact exactly what it appeared to be. An aging, lightly armed vessel of a design already a decade out of date, crewed by 41 souls whose sole job today was to sit very still, transmit exactly the right amount of false bravado over an open channel, and not, under any circumstances, do anything that might suggest they were anything other than terrified. Its captain, a weathered veteran named Alina Marsh, who had spent the better part of her career flying a ship everyone assumed was obsolete, watched the alien fleet crest the system boundary on her secondary display and felt her pulse do something complicated in her chest. Not fear, exactly. She had made peace with the possibility of dying doing this job roughly 4 years ago, on the day the colony's shadow government first briefed her on what Kepler Verdance actually was, beneath the crop rotation arguments and the amateur ball sport broadcasts. What she felt now was closer to the sensation of watching a very large, very confident predator walk directly into a snare it had no idea existed. There was something almost sad about it. Almost. 741 hulls, her tactical officer murmured, reading off the passive scan results in a voice gone tight with the effort of sounding calm. Christ, they brought a war. They brought a parade, Marsh corrected, keying open the pre-scripted broadcast channel. Let's give them one. What the Valorian sensor arrays registered next, and what Threxin Vaol watched unfold on the Ascendancy's primary display with the faint, indulgent smile of a species that had done this 11,000 times before, was a masterpiece of theatrical cowardice 3 years in the writing. The Cold Harbor's weapons batteries, such as they were, powered down entirely. Its shields, already thin and unimpressive by Dominion standards, dropped to a bare life support minimum. A ragged, unencrypted distress signal began broadcasting on every open frequency the Dominion's listening posts monitored. A human voice, Marsh's own, coached over 18 months by a linguistics team to hit precisely the right note of controlled panic, informing any receiving vessel that Kepler Verdant's Colonial Defense Command formally requested terms of surrender be transmitted at the invading fleet's earliest convenience, and that the colony possessed no capacity and no intention to resist. Behind that broadcast, buried in the colony's planetary data stream where Dominion infiltration algorithms would be certain to find it, months of carefully fabricated Civil Defense Committee logs described budget shortfalls, obsolete equipment, low troop morale, and a colonial council split 3 ways on whether resistance was even worth attempting. It was, Threxin thought, exactly what he had expected. It was, more specifically, exactly what the humans wanted him to think he had expected, which was a distinction so fine and so deliberately invisible that not one soul aboard the Eternal Ascendancy noticed it. Marshal, the human vessel, is broadcasting terms of surrender, Ithara reported, and for the first time in 30 years of service, Threxin heard something in her voice that was not quite paranoia and not quite satisfaction, but sat somewhere uncomfortably between the two. Compliance protocols are already active in the colony's defense network. There is no weapons fire risk detected anywhere in the system. Then let us not keep them waiting, Threxin said, rising from his command throne with the ceremonial grace the moment demanded. Bring the fleet to standard occupation posture. Advance to orbital insertion range. I want the honor guard prepared within the hour, and I want this recorded from every angle the Cortex relay can carry. Let the Thren expanse watch this. Let them see how quickly wisdom arrives when it is properly motivated. The Radiant Lotus formation began its slow, ponderous advance, 741 warships sliding deeper into the Kepler-Verdant system, with the unhurried confidence of a species that had never once needed to hurry. And 300,000 kilometers away, tucked into the roiling amber storm bands of Calliope Prime's upper atmosphere, in a debris shadow so precisely calculated that it would have taken a targeting algorithm specifically hunting for it to find anything at all, 412 human warships sat in absolute electromagnetic silence, engines cold, reactors idling at the barest fraction above shutdown waiting. Fleet Admiral Diana Reyes had commanded the Kepler-Verdant's combined defense fleet for 6 years, ever since the Colonial Council had quietly voted, in a session that appeared nowhere in any public record, to stop pretending Kepler-Verdant's was the sleepy agricultural backwater its official filings described, and start becoming the trap it would need to be the day someone like Threxin Vaol finally came looking. She stood now on the flag bridge of the fleet carrier Sun Tzu, watching the same tactical plot that Threxin watched, seeing the same 741 hulls crawl across the same dark, except that where Threxin saw 600,000 farmers ripe for the taking, Reyes saw 741 targets, ranked, prioritized, and already assigned firing solutions that her staff had refined across 11 separate wargame iterations over the preceding 18 months. They've bought it, said her chief of staff, Captain Marcus Webb, a broad-shouldered man with the permanently narrowed eyes of someone who had spent a decade running the numbers on exactly this scenario. Full advance, standard occupation posture. Their sensor doctrine hasn't even bothered to sweep the gas giant beyond a passive thermal scan. They think we're too primitive to hide behind a planet. They think a lot of things, Reyes said quietly. She was a small, unremarkable-looking woman, the kind of person who could walk through a crowded room without turning a single head, which was, she had long ago decided, the single most useful trait a fleet commander could possess. She did not raise her voice. She had never needed to. How's the cold harbor? Marsh reports nominal, her crews holding position, playing terrified beautifully. She says, and I quote, "These bastards moved their entire honor guard prep sequence live on an open channel. They genuinely think this is over." Reyes almost smiled. Almost. Order the fleet to maintain silent posture until the Dominion's lead elements cross the 40,000-kilometer marker relative to the orbital platforms. Not 1 second before. I don't want a single reactor spiking hot until that fleet is committed past the point where they can retreat without losing formation cohesion. She turned to the plot, studying the slow crawl of red icons deeper into the system's gravity well, deeper into a killing ground that had been under construction, quietly, patiently, for 6 years. Let them get comfortable. The thing about the Valorian Dominion, which its intelligence apparatus had never once bothered to properly interrogate in 11,000 years of unbroken conquest, was that its entire threat assessment doctrine was built on a foundational and catastrophic assumption that technological sophistication scaled predictably with visible infrastructure. A species with grand shipyards and gleaming orbital fortresses was dangerous. A species with quaint agricultural satellites and a single obsolete cruiser was not. It was an assumption that had served the Dominion extraordinarily well against 11,000 years of civilizations, that built the way the Dominion expected civilizations to build, loudly, visibly, with monuments to their own martial pride blazoned across every orbital lane. It had never once encountered a species that understood the terrifying tactical value of looking exactly as harmless as its enemy needed it to look. Kepler-Verdance's Agricultural Coordination Network, the ring of 41 orbital satellites that Dominion surveillance had spent 11 years cataloging as weather monitors and crop yield relays, were, in point of fact, 41 Hades pattern orbital defense platforms, each one a masterwork of disguise engineering that had cost the human colony more in resources and labor than every other piece of visible infrastructure in the system combined. Their outer hulls were genuine, functioning agricultural sensor arrays, broadcasting genuine, functioning agricultural data. Because the single greatest lesson the architects of Kepler-Verdance's defense had learned from 6 years of wargaming against simulated Dominion doctrine was that a lie wrapped around a truth was invisible in a way that a lie alone could never be. Beneath that authentic outer shell, each platform carried a Gauss-accelerated railgun array capable of flinging a 15-kilogram tungsten composite slug at 11 kilometers per second. Not fast enough to matter against a target expecting it, but the platforms weren't there to be expected. They were there to be dismissed, catalogued, forgotten, and then, on one very specific afternoon, to fire in perfect synchronized volleys directly into the unshielded flanks of an enemy fleet that had never imagined a farming satellite could kill anything larger than a weed. The single Aegis-class cruiser, similarly, was exactly as advertised and utterly beside the point. The actual defense of Kepler-Verdance, the 412 warships of Admiral Reyes's combined defense fleet, existed nowhere in 11 years of Dominion surveillance because they had been built, crewed, and stationed in complete secrecy behind Calliope Prime's roiling atmosphere. Their hulls coated in a radar and thermal dampening composite developed specifically to defeat Dominion long-range sensor doctrine. Their engines run at a power curve calibrated to produce a heat signature indistinguishable from the gas giant's own storm activity. It was, Webb liked to say, the single most expensive magic trick in human history, and its entire purpose was to exist for one afternoon and then never need to hide again. The fleet itself was a study in everything the Dominion's Class 5 minimal threat designation insisted humanity did not possess. At its core sat 2 Leviathan-class fleet carriers, the Sun Tzu and her sister ship Bolivar, each 900 meters of matte black hull built not around the grand ornamental plasma cannons the Dominion favored but around drone bays, 480 autonomous strike drones per carrier, 960 in total, each one a lean, coldly efficient killing machine barely larger than an ancient atmospheric fighter. Networked into a single distributed combat intelligence that could react to battlefield changes in milliseconds no biological commander could match. Flanking the carriers, 60 Talon-class railgun cruisers, their entire midsections given over to twin-mounted Gauss accelerators 3 times the caliber of the orbital platforms, capable of putting a slug through a battle cruiser's primary armor belt at ranges the Dominion's plasma weapons couldn't hope to match. And at the tip of the formation, the weapon that Reyes's staff had nicknamed, with the particular dark humor of people who build machines meant to end things, the Sunbreakers, 12 heavy cruisers, each one carrying a single nuclear-pumped X-ray laser array in its bow, A weapon so fundamentally alien to Dominion combat doctrine that their sensor classification algorithms wouldn't even have a category for it until it was already tearing through their armor. Nuclear-pumped lasing was not a technology the Dominion possessed. Because it was not a technology any species in the Dominion's 11,000-year conquest had ever needed to develop. It required a civilization desperate enough, resource-constrained enough, and technically brilliant enough to solve an engineering problem that most species simply threw more plasma cannons at instead. How to convert the output of a small, precisely shaped nuclear detonation into a single coherent beam of soft X-rays before the detonation itself destroyed the mechanism generating it. Humanity had solved it in the early years of Kepler-Verdens's secret militarization program not because anyone particularly wanted to, but because a colony with limited industrial capacity, no access to exotic Dominion-tier plasma technology, and a desperate need to punch far above its weight class had run the numbers and discovered that a single-use, one-shot weapon capable of delivering more destructive energy in a single pulse than a Dreadnought's main battery could produce in 10 was. In fact, achievable with metallurgy and physics the humans already understood. Each Sunbreaker carried exactly one such weapon. Each weapon could fire exactly once before the detonation destroyed its own generating mechanism. And each one, properly aimed, could gut a Dominion battlecruiser from bow to stern in a single pulse of directed radiation that no shield technology in the Dominion's arsenal had ever been designed to stop, because no shield technology in the Dominion's arsenal had ever needed to stop it before. Aboard the Eternal Ascendancy, Threxin Vaol watched his fleet cross the 40,000-kilometer marker with the serene satisfaction of a man watching a ceremony proceed exactly as scripted. The colony world hung directly ahead now, close enough that its continents had resolved into visible detail on the main display, green and brown and threaded with the silver lines of rivers. Entirely unremarkable, entirely undefended, entirely his. He had already begun composing, in the private theater of his own mind, the opening lines of the address he would deliver from the planet's surface once the honor guard secured the primary settlement. Something about inevitability, something about the wisdom of surrender. The Cortex sensors liked when he quoted the old Valorian proverbs, the ones about the river that erodes the mountain not through violence but through patience. And he thought this particular conquest, so bloodless, so clean, so thoroughly anticlimactic, would make a lovely frame for exactly that sentiment. Marshal, Ithara said, and there it was again, that thread of something in her voice that was not quite paranoia. I am detecting a minor thermal anomaly at the gas giant, Calliope Prime. It registers within expected storm band parameters, but the pattern has repeated 3 times in the last 20 minutes with unusual regularity. Storms are not known for their regularity, Vice Commander, which is rather the point of the word. I am aware, Marshal, I flag it regardless. Threxin considered, for exactly 4 seconds, ordering a deep sensor sweep of the gas giant. It would have cost him nothing. It would have taken his fleet's passive arrays perhaps 90 seconds to resolve 412 radar-dampened hulls sitting in a debris shadow they had occupied for 6 years, and it would have unraveled the entire trap before a single shot was fired. He did not give the order because in 11,000 years of Dominion conquest, no Class 5 minimal threat species had ever once possessed the capacity to hide a fleet, let alone the reason to try, and Threxin Vaol's mind, shaped by 11 millennia of institutional certainty, simply did not generate the hypothesis. This was not stupidity. It was something more dangerous than stupidity. It was the particular, specific blindness of a species that had never once needed to imagine an enemy cleverer than itself, and so had quietly, gradually, over 11,000 years of unbroken victory, lost the muscle required to try. You continue advance, he said. Bring the transports forward to standard planetfall distance. I want the honor guard shuttles prepped within the half hour. The order rippled down through the Dominion's command structure, and the Radiant Lotus formation, 741 warships strong drifted deeper into the killing ground that Admiral Diana Reyes had spent 6 years, and every resource her colony could quietly muster preparing for this exact moment. The 40 transports carrying 200,000 ground pacification troops began edging forward from the rear of the formation, precisely as Dominion doctrine dictated, moving toward the planet ahead of the fleet's protective envelope in the confident expectation that no defense worth the name existed to threaten them. It was, Reyes noted on the Sun Tzu's tactical plot, with the flat clinical satisfaction of a surgeon watching an incision open exactly along the planned line, the single worst tactical decision available to the Dominion fleet commander, and he had made it entirely on his own, entirely without prompting. Entirely because 11,000 years of easy victories had taught him that unarmed transports were safe wherever an enemy had already surrendered. "They're bringing the troop transports forward," Webb said, his voice carefully neutral in the way of a man forcing himself not to sound eager. "Ahead of the capital ship screen, Admiral, that's exactly what we built this trap to make them do," Reyes finished. She studied the plot a moment longer, watching the Dominion formation's icons continue their slow crawl, the 40 transport hulls now fully exposed at the leading edge, the 200 battle cruisers and destroyers arrayed behind them in a formation optimized for ceremony rather than combat. Every railgun platform disguised as farmland had a firing solution locked. Every drone bay aboard the Sun Tzu and the Bolivar sat loaded and ready, their launch tubes cold and silent waiting. Every sunbreaker had its single irreplaceable shot aimed and recalculated 40 times in the last hour alone as the enemy formation shifted. Reyes closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, not out of hesitation, but because 6 years of her life had led to this precise moment, and some small human part of her wanted to mark it before the killing began. Then she opened them, and her voice, when it came, was as calm and unhurried as it had been every day of the 6-year wait. "Colonel Webb, signal Captain Marsh. Tell her the Cold Harbor's part is done. Full retreat to the secondary rally point, best possible speed the moment I give the order." "Yes, Admiral." "And signal the orbital defense grid, all 41 platforms. Confirm firing solutions on the primary target list. Prioritize the transport screen and the 2 battle cruisers first. I want their troop lift and their heaviest hitters gone before they even understand what's happening to them. Confirm the carrier drone wings are hot and ready for immediate launch the moment I give the mark." She paused, watching the plot, watching the Eternal Ascendancy's massive silhouette drift another few thousand kilometers deeper into range, its escort screen thinning almost imperceptibly as the formation's attention remained fixed entirely forward, entirely on the planet, entirely on the conquest it believed was already won. "And somebody get me an open channel to that flagship. I want them to hear this before we open fire. They've earned that much." Aboard the Eternal Ascendancy, the Honor Guard shuttles had just begun their launch sequence when the Dominion's communication officer reported an incoming transmission on an open frequency, unencrypted, human in origin and Threxin Vaol. Mildly curious what final theatrical flourish his soon-to-be subjects intended to offer, perhaps a formal reading of surrender terms, perhaps some quaint ceremonial gesture, ordered it patched through to the bridge. The voice that came through was calm, unhurried, female, human, speaking trade, standard with an accent the Dominion's linguistic databases flagged as North American English colonial dialect. It did not sound like the voice of a species about to be conquered. "Valorian Fleet Commander, this is Fleet Admiral Diana Reyes, Kepler Verdant's Combined Defense Fleet. Your intelligence designated this system a Class 5 minimal threat. I want you to know before this ends that we built that designation on purpose. Every satellite you scanned, every distress call you intercepted, every troop transport you just moved into the open, all of it was built for this exact moment. You are not conquering a colony, Marshal. You walked your entire fleet into a killing ground 6 years in the making, and you did it because your species has not lost a war in so long that you forgot how to imagine losing one. I would tell you to surrender, but I don't think you'd believe me yet. So instead, I'll just say this. Watch your sensors very closely over the next 90 seconds. It's the last chance you'll get to understand what's about to happen to you before it's simply happening. The channel went dead. For exactly 3 seconds, the bridge of the eternal ascendancy was silent. Every officer present caught in that particular vertiginous species of confusion that occurs when a mind encounters information it has no framework to process. Threxin Vaol opened his mouth to dismiss the transmission as bravado, as the last desperate flailing of a doomed species, and then Athara Nal's 4 eyes went wide, all at once, and her voice cracked through the silence in a tone that 30 years of service had never once produced. Marshal, thermal bloom, Calliope prime, mass contact. 400, no, correcting, 412 individual hull signatures emerging from the gas giant's upper atmosphere, and orbital platform arrays across the entire colony grid are reclassifying as. She never finished the sentence, because at that precise moment, the trap that Admiral Diana Reyes had spent 6 years building finally closed. The 41 Hades pattern orbital platforms fired first, their disguises falling away in the same instant their railguns discharged, and the effect on the Dominion formation was less like the opening of a battle and more like the sudden, silent detonation of a bomb that had been sitting, patient and invisible, in the middle of the room for 6 years. 15-kilogram tungsten composite slugs, accelerated to 11 kilometers per second by magnetic rails that had spent a decade disguised as crop yield sensors, crossed the intervening distance to the Dominion's forward formation in under 4 seconds, and they did not care about shields calibrated to disperse plasma energy, because kinetic mass moving at that velocity did not disperse. It simply arrived, and everything in its path ceased to exist as a coherent structure. The 2 lead troop transports, still mid-deployment of their honor guard shuttles, took 3 slugs each across their unshielded flanks and came apart in silent, blooming clouds of debris and atmosphere, and the 200 pacification troops who had spent the transit dreaming about the easiest campaign of their careers. 11 more transports died in the same 4-second window, their hulls simply punched through, decompressed, gutted before a single Dominion. Weapons officer had managed to raise a targeting solution on anything. Aboard the Sun Tzu, Reyes watched the tactical plot bloom with impact markers and felt no satisfaction, only the cold, focused clarity of a plan executing precisely as designed. "Launch the drone wings," she said. "All 4 wings, full spread, target priority as briefed, battle cruisers and destroyer screen first, keep them from reforming a coherent defense. Sunbreakers, you are cleared to fire at will on primary targets. Talon Squadron, advance to engagement range and begin railgun barrage on my mark." The 960 drones erupted from the Sun Tzu and Bolivar's launch bays in a single coordinated wave that looked, on Dominion sensors, like nothing so much as a swarm of angry insects pouring from 2 great dark hives. And it was in the drones that the true, terrible sophistication of humanity's deception revealed itself most completely. Each drone was small, cheap by Dominion capital ship standards, individually almost trivial. A single Dominion point-defense turret could, in principle, swat one from the sky without difficulty. But the drones did not fight individually. They fought as a single distributed mind, 960 sensor nodes and 960 weapons platforms feeding into a combat intelligence that processed the entire battle space in real time and reassigned targets, formations, and attack vectors faster than any biological command structure could track, let alone counter. They swarmed the Dominion's destroyer screen in overlapping waves, each drone diving in to deliver a burst of directed energy fire against a single, algorithmically selected weak point in a target's shield geometry before peeling away, forcing 96 Dominion destroyers to fragment their point-defense fire across a threat that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, that never presented a fixed target long enough to be properly countered. That bled them from 1,000 small wounds, while their heavier weapons, built to crack capital armor, found nothing large enough to be worth firing at. Point defense is not tracking, a Dominion destroyer captain screamed into the fleet-wide command channel. His voice one of dozens now flooding the same frequency in a rising chorus of confusion and panic that Threxin Vaol, still frozen on his own bridge in the grip of a disbelief so total it had become its own kind of paralysis, could do nothing to organize. They're too small, too fast, the targeting arrays can't. The transmission cut off in a burst of static as a drone wing found the destroyer's engine core and opened it to space. And then the Sunbreakers fired. There were only 12 of them, and each one would only ever fire once. And Admiral Reyes had spent 6 years and countless wargame iterations deciding exactly which 12 targets in a Dominion fleet were worth spending an irreplaceable weapon on. 11 of the shots went to the Dominion's battle cruisers and heaviest cruiser-class hulls, the ships whose armor and shield geometry made them the one category of target the railguns and drone swarms would struggle to crack quickly. The 12th was aimed, with a kind of grim and deliberate symbolism that Reyes had authorized personally, directly at the Eternal Ascendancy itself. A nuclear-pumped X-ray laser does not announce itself the way a plasma barrage does. There is no visible beam, no dramatic bloom of energy crossing the dark, simply a small, contained detonation aboard the firing vessel, and then an instant later and hundreds of thousands of kilometers away, a target's armor belt failing in a way that looks, to anyone watching, like the ship has simply begun to come apart from the inside for no visible reason at all. The Wrath of Karnos, second in command of the entire Dominion strike force, took its Sunbreaker pulse directly amidships, and its heavy plasma capacitor banks, designed to contain controlled discharges of directed energy, never designed to survive the sudden, catastrophic dump of soft X-ray radiation punched clean through their containment shielding. Detonated in a chain reaction that turned 900 meters of Dominion battlecruiser into an expanding sphere of superheated plasma and wreckage in under 2 seconds. 9,000 crew died in that expansion, and not one of them had time to understand what had killed them. The pulse meant for the Eternal Ascendancy struck a fraction of a second later, and here at last, 11,000 years of Dominion over-engineering purchased Threxin Vaol something his tactical doctrine and his sensor arrays never had: survival at a price. The flagship's armor belt, 4 times thicker than any other hull in the fleet, absorbed the pulse's initial radiation shell in a catastrophic cascade of failing plating along its entire starboard flank, an entire kilometer of hull simply boiling away into vapor and shrapnel. 3 of its primary plasma emitter arrays gutted beyond. Repair, secondary containment breaches rippling down 6 decks in a chain of explosions that Threxin felt through the deck plating of the bridge itself as a series of grinding, bone-deep shudders. The Ascendancy did not die. It came instead to a kind of terrible, crippled half-life, venting atmosphere and superheated plasma from a wound the size of a city, its main gun offline, its command systems flickering under the strain of damage control protocols trying to save a ship that had never once, in its 400 years of service, taken a wound it could not simply shrug off. Threxin Vaol was thrown from his command throne by the impact and struck the deck hard enough to crack the outer plating of his exoskeletal harness. And for a long, disorienting moment, sprawled on the deck of his own bridge amid the screaming of alarms and the panicked cross-chatter of a command staff that had never once in their careers needed to manage an active crisis of this magnitude. He understood, with a clarity that felt almost like drowning, that everything the Dominion's Central Intelligence Cortex had told him about this system was not merely wrong, but had been deliberately, meticulously, patiently engineered to be wrong by an enemy that had understood his own doctrine better than he did. Ithara pulled him upright, her own harness scorched and one of her 4 eyes clouded with burst capillaries from the shock of the impact, and her voice, when she spoke, had lost every trace of the careful professional detachment she had maintained for 30 years. Marshal, we are losing the destroyer screen. 61 hulls destroyed or disabled in the last 90 seconds. The troop transports are gone, all 40. The Wrath of Karnos is gone, total loss, all hands. The undying testament is under heavy fire from what our sensors are now identifying as railgun-armed cruiser classes, previously undetected, emerging from the gas giant's shadow in coordinated strike formation. We are Marshal, we are being systematically destroyed, and I do not have a doctrine for this. Nothing in 3 centuries of Cortex combat analysis prepared us for an enemy that could hide a fleet this size, disguise weapons platforms this thoroughly, and deploy autonomous strike craft in coordinated distributed swarms. This is not a Class 5 threat response. This is not any threat response our doctrine has ever catalogued. Threxin stared at the tactical plot, and for the first time in 11,000 years of Dominion military history, though he could not know this, would never live to properly appreciate the magnitude of what he was the first to experience. A Valorian fleet marshal watched his formation's carefully cultivated aura of inevitability dissolve in real time, replaced by something the Dominion's entire culture had no proper vocabulary for, because it had never needed one. Fear born not of an enemy's strength, which the Dominion understood and respected and had built 11,000 years of doctrine to counter, but of an enemy's patience. The specific surgical horror of realizing that everything you believed about your target had been constructed for you, brick by careful brick over years, by a mind that understood exactly how you thought and had built a 6-year trap around the precise shape of your own certainty. There was, in those first 4 seconds of engagement, a particular kind of violence that no Dominion combat simulation had ever modeled, because no Dominion combat simulation had ever needed to account for an enemy who understood the precise geometry of Valorian shield doctrine well enough to defeat it, without firing a single shot that Dominion sensors classified as a genuine threat, until it was already too late to matter. Valorian shields were built across 11,000 years of refinement to disperse and absorb energy weapons. The plasma bolts, the particle beams, the directed energy doctrine that every conquered species the Dominion had ever encountered eventually adopted. Because energy weapons were elegant, efficient, and easy to mass produce once a civilization crossed a certain technological threshold. What Valorian shields had never once been asked to stop, in 11,000 years of institutional memory, was mass. Pure, brute, kinetic mass, indifferent to elegant field geometry, carrying momentum that did not care what frequency of radiation a shield generator was tuned to disperse. The humans had understood this asymmetry with a clarity that bordered on the surgical, and they had built their entire opening barrage around exploiting it before the Dominion's officers even had the vocabulary to describe what was killing them. Aboard the Talon-class cruiser Meridian, third in the human railgun formation now surging out from behind Calliope Prime's amber shadow, gunnery officer Priya Anand watched her targeting board populate with the ident signatures of 6 Dominion destroyers still holding format. Ian, despite the chaos rippling through the fleet around them, and felt the particular, focused calm that 18 months of live-fire drills had trained into her like muscle memory. "Solutions locked, all 6, she reported. "Rail charge at 91% and climbing." Her captain gave the order without hesitation, and the Meridian's twin accelerators discharged in a rolling, thunderous sequence that would have been silent in the vacuum outside her hull but registered inside the ship as a series of deep, bone-jarring shudders that ran the length of the vessel like a struck bell. 11 kilometers per second. At that velocity, a 15-kilogram slug carried kinetic energy equivalent to several tons of high explosive, and it did not detonate on impact the way a missile warhead might, spreading its force outward in a survivable bloom. It simply punched through armor and bulkhead and reactor housing and crew compartment alike, in a straight, merciless line, and everything along that line ceased in the space of a heartbeat to be a coherent ship. 3 of the 6 destroyers died in that single volley. The other 3, their captains finally understanding in the last frantic seconds available to them, that maneuverability rather than shield strength was their only remaining defense against a weapon that ignored shields entirely, broke formation and scattered directly into the path of the incoming drone swarm, which had been waiting with the patient, distributed intelligence of 960 networked minds for exactly that mistake. Threxin Vaol, still finding his footing on a deck that would not stop shuddering beneath him, watched his tactical plot resolve the shape of the human fleet's design with a dawning, horrified comprehension that arrived far too late to be useful. It was not one weapon that was destroying his fleet. It was three, woven together with a precision that suggested years, not months, of deliberate doctrinal integration. The railguns to crack armor and force his ships into evasive maneuvers. The drone swarm to punish exactly the evasive maneuvers those railguns forced. And behind both of them, waiting 12 single-shot weapons of a class his own intelligence services had never once catalogued, held in reserve for the handful of targets hardened enough to survive the first two waves. It was not brute force. It was an ambush constructed with the layered, interlocking logic of a hunter who had studied its prey's every instinct long before the prey ever arrived to have those instincts tested. "Ithara," he said, and his voice, for the first time since the engagement began, carried something that was not quite command and not quite despair but sat uneasily somewhere between the two. "Signal every remaining captain. Independent maneuver authorized. I no longer have a formation worth preserving, and I will not spend one more hull proving that fact to a species that has clearly already run every simulation required to know it." The order came too late for the destroyer screen's remaining cohesion to matter, but it likely saved what remained of the fleet from complete annihilation, because it was in those scattered, independent minutes Dominion captains breaking from doctrine for the first time in their careers, making individual desperate choices about where to point their dying ships, that the human drone swarm's networked intelligence found itself, for the first and only time in the engagement, genuinely taxed. A distributed combat mind built to counter coordinated enemy formations struggled, briefly, against the raw unpredictability of 200 ships each fleeing in a direction no doctrine had trained them to choose. And in that brief window, perhaps 30 Dominion hulls that the swarm's targeting priority would otherwise have marked for destruction slipped instead into the deeper dark beyond the immediate killing zone, battered, burning, but alive. It was not victory. It was not even a meaningful reprieve. But it was, Reyes would later note in the after-action report she filed with the Colonial Council, the single most useful piece of tactical data the entire engagement produced. Proof that even a devastated, disorganized enemy, once it abandoned the doctrine that had gotten it killed, could still find seams in a plan that had, until that moment, seemed to account for everything. The battle, if it could still be called that rather than the systematic unmaking it had become, continued for 11 more minutes, and every one of those minutes widened the gap between what the Dominion fleet had believed itself capable of and what it was actually enduring. The Talon-class railgun cruisers, having close to engagement range under cover of the drone swarm's chaos, began methodical, almost clinical fire against the Dominion's remaining battlecruiser and heavy cruiser formations, their gunnery officers working through a target list that had been refined across 11 game iterations with a precision that felt, to the Dominion officers desperately trying to organize a coherent return fire, less like combat and more like execution. Where Dominion plasma weapons relied on shield-penetrating heat and volume of fire, the Talon cruiser's railgun slugs simply did not care what a target's shields were rated to disperse, because kinetic energy delivered at 11 kilometers per second did not disperse, did not diffuse, did not care about elegant Dominion energy shield doctrine at all. It arrived, and it kept arriving. In disciplined, 3-round volleys that walked systematically down the length of each targeted hull, until something vital ruptured. The Undying Testament, the Dominion's second battlecruiser and the last capital ship in the fleet still capable of coordinated offensive action, made the only decision available to a captain watching his formation die around him. It turned its full weapons battery against the nearest concentration of drone craft, hoping to break the swarm's cohesion and buy the fleet room to organize a retreat. For nearly 90 seconds, it seemed almost to work. The Testament's point-defense grid, finally properly calibrated against the drone's attack pattern, began scoring kills, its heavy plasma cannons carving burning gaps through the swarm's leading edge. And then 3 Talon cruisers, working in perfect concert with a targeting solution relayed directly from the Sun Tzu's combat intelligence, put 27 railgun slugs into the Testament's engine section in a single coordinated volley. And the battle cruiser that had, for 90 seconds, represented the Dominion fleet's last real hope of an organized defense, went dark, drifting, its reactor scrammed and its weapons silent. One more crippled hulk among dozens now tumbling through a battle space that had, in the span of 13 minutes, become an unrecognizable graveyard of Dominion engineering. Aboard the Eternal Ascendancy, damage control teams fought a losing battle against fires that would not extinguish and hull breaches that would not seal. And Threxin Vaol stood on a bridge lit by emergency lighting, and the flickering orange glow of secondary explosions rippling somewhere aft, watching the tactical plot narrow from 741 hulls to something closer to 400, then 300. The numbers falling with a speed that had stopped registering as data and started registering as something closer to physical pain. He thought in the strange, disconnected way that minds sometimes retreat into abstraction when confronted with catastrophe too large to process directly, of his own opening address. The one about the river and the mountain, the patient erosion of resistance through inevitability, and he understood now with a bitterness that tasted like ash that the humans had simply been better students of that proverb than he had ever been. They had been patient. They had eroded not his fleet, not yet, not entirely, but his certainty, his doctrine, the 11,000-year foundation of assumption upon which every Dominion victory had ever been built. And they had done it so completely and so quietly that he had walked his entire strike force directly into the widening of that erosion, without ever once suspecting the ground beneath him had already given way. Marshal, Ithara said, and her voice now carried none of the paranoia that had once made her irritating and all of the flat, exhausted clarity of an officer who has run out of options. 291 hulls remaining combat-capable by generous estimate. We have lost contact with 60% of our destroyer screen. Both battle cruisers are disabled or destroyed. The troop transports are gone in their entirety. Our own hull is at 40% structural integrity, main weapons offline, and continued exposure to that railgun formation will reduce us to a debris field within the hour at current damage rates. I am obligated, as your tactical officer, to inform you that by every metric this fleet's own doctrine uses to assess combat viability, we have already lost this engagement. Threxin closed his eyes. He thought of 11,000 years of unbroken victory, of the surrender ceremonies he had personally overseen on 41 worlds across his own long career, of the particular, practiced cadence of the words he used to invite a defeated species to lay down its weapons with whatever dignity the Dominion chose to permit them. He had never once, in all those ceremonies, considered what it might feel like to be the one delivering the request rather than receiving it. And he discovered now that 11,000 years of institutional certainty had prepared him for absolutely nothing about this moment, except the shape of the words themselves. "Open a channel," he said, and his voice when it emerged was quieter than he intended, quieter than a Dominion Fleet Marshal's voice had any right to be. To the hum. "And flagship, Fleet Admiral Reyes, you said her designation was." "Marshal, are you certain?" "Ithara." He turned to face her, and whatever she saw in his expression stopped whatever else she had been about to say. "We have 291 ships and perhaps 60,000 crew remaining in a fleet that arrived here with 741 hulls and over 280,000 souls. I have just watched an enemy our own cortex rated beneath contempt annihilate the greater part of a force that had never, in 11,000 years, failed to secure its objective. I am not interested in discovering what remains of my certainty by testing it against the 60,000 lives still under my command. Open the channel." The transmission reached the Sun Tzu 90 seconds later, and Admiral Reyes, who had spent the preceding 13 minutes watching her 6-year plan execute with a precision that left surprisingly little room for triumph, mostly, if she was honest with herself, because triumph required a kind of emotional bandwidth that active fleet command simply did not permit, took the call standing, her hands folded behind her back in the same posture she had held for the entire engagement. Fleet Admiral Ray's, Threxin Vaol's voice translated through the trade standard protocols both fleet systems had long ago adopted, carried an unmistakable, careful flatness, the sound of a man choosing every word with the precision of someone walking across ice he no longer trusted. This is High Fleet Marshal Threxin Vaol, commanding what remains of the Valorian Dominion 3rd Expeditionary Fleet. I am requesting terms. I'm listening, Marshal. You will forgive me, he said, and there was something in the words that might, in a human voice, have carried the ghost of dark humor, though whether Valorian psychology permitted such a thing even in extremity was a question Ray's did not have the context to answer. If I ask how long you built this? Our intelligence rated this system a Class 5 minimal threat. I would like to understand how thoroughly we were wrong before I explain it to my superiors, assuming I am given the opportunity to explain anything to anyone ever again. 6 years, Marshal, from the day the Colonial Council first authorized the program, Ray's said. Though if you're asking how long we've understood that a species like yours would eventually find us and assume exactly what your intelligence assumed, that's closer to the entire history of Kepler Verdance. We didn't build a farming colony that happened to need defenses. We built a trap that needed a farming colony's face to hide behind, and we were patient enough to let it look convincing for as long as it took. She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried no cruelty, only a kind of weary, clinical honesty that Threxin found, in some strange way, more unsettling than triumph would have been. You're not the first fleet to underestimate a Class 5 designation, Marshal. You're simply the first one to find out what happens when the designation was written by the people it was meant to fool. Threxin absorbed this in silence for a long moment, and on the ruined bridge of the Eternal Ascendancy, surrounded by the smell of burnt insulation and the distant, rhythmic groan of a hull fighting to hold itself together, he found himself doing something no Valorian fleet marshal had done in living memory. He laughed, a short, bitter, involuntary sound that had nothing to do with amusement, and everything to do with the particular vertigo of watching 11,000 years of institutional certainty collapse into a single, humiliating afternoon. He thought in the strange, cascading way a mind sometimes tries to protect itself by fleeing into irrelevant detail, of the honor guard shuttles he had ordered prepped less than an hour earlier, their crews now dead or scattered among the wreckage of the transport screen, the ceremonial banners they would have carried to the planet's surface now drifting somewhere in the debris field alongside the bodies of soldiers who had spent the transit playing dice, certain there would be nothing here worth their skill. He thought of the 11-year survey his own cortex had commissioned, the passive sensor sweeps and infiltrated data relays that had produced, with such confident, meticulous precision, a threat assessment that had turned out to be not merely wrong but weaponized. A lie so carefully calibrated to Dominion expectation that it had functioned less like intelligence and more like a key cut to fit the exact shape of his own fleet's blind spots. He understood, with the particular clarity that only total, undeniable defeat seems capable of producing, that the humans had not defeated the Dominion's weapons at all. They had defeated its epistemology, its entire inherited, unexamined method of deciding what counted as dangerous, and every ship he had lost in the last 13 minutes was simply the visible, physical consequence of a mistake his species had made years before the first Dominion sensor ever detected the Kepler Verdant system at all. Ithara, watching him with her one remaining clear eye, said nothing for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the crisp tactical cadence she had maintained through 30 years of service. Marshal, what do we tell the Cortex? The truth, Threxin said, and the word tasted strange in his mouth, foreign in a way that 11,000 years of Dominion doctrine had never quite prepared him to voice about a defeat of this magnitude. All of it, every ship, every casualty, every assumption we made, and every one of them that turned out to be exactly backward. I do not know what the cortex will do with a report like that. I do not know if it has ever received one. But I find that I no longer have the appetite to spend what remains of this fleet's credibility protecting an institution that built the blindness which killed 60,000 of my people this afternoon. The terms, Admiral, he said finally, I am listening. They're simple, Reyes said. Full stand-down of all remaining weapon systems, fleet-wide, effective immediately, verified by our boarding teams. Your surviving vessels will be permitted to retain life support, propulsion, and enough structural integrity to make the journey home. But every offensive system aboard every hull in your fleet will be disabled under our supervision before you leave this system. You will transmit on whatever channel your command structure requires. A full and accurate account of what happened here today, not a sanitized version, not a face-saving version, the truth in full, including the size of the force you brought and the size of the force that defeated it. And you will carry back to whatever authority issued that Class 5 minimal threat designation a very simple message. That designation is retired. Permanently. Kepler-Verdance and every human colony this designation might ever have been applied to is no longer a minimal threat. And any future fleet that arrives here or anywhere humanity has a flag planted, expecting the war we just fought to have been an aberration rather than a demonstration, will receive exactly the same welcome you did, refined by whatever we learn from today. That's the whole of it, Marshal. No executions, no occupation. No humiliation beyond the truth itself, which I recognize is not a small thing to ask a species like yours to carry home. But I'd rather you carry it home honestly than have your superiors send a second fleet believing the first one simply had bad luck. There was a long silence on the channel, long enough that Reyes' staff began exchanging uncertain glances, wondering if the transmission had failed. Then Threxin Vaol's voice returned, quieter than before and stripped, for the first time in the entire exchange, of every trace of Dominion formality. 60,000 of my people are alive today, Admiral, who by every doctrine I have ever been trained in should be dead, because you chose to offer terms rather than complete an annihilation you had, by your own account, spent 6 years preparing to execute with perfect efficiency. I do not know what to make of that mercy. My own doctrine has no framework for it. But I will carry your message home, in full, and I will carry it honestly, because I find that I no longer entirely trust my own judgment about what this Dominion's doctrine has prepared me to believe. A pause. For what it is worth, Fleet Admiral, and I understand it may be worth very little, coming from the man who just lost 450 ships and 200,000 lives to a trap I never saw coming, I do not believe the last thing my Cortex assessment got wrong about your species was your capacity for violence. I believe the thing it got wrong first, the thing that made the rest of the error possible, was assuming that a quiet species is a weak one. I do not think I will make that particular mistake again, if I am given the chance to make any mistakes at all. No, Reyes said quietly, watching through the Sun Tzu's forward viewport as the wreckage of the Dominion's 3rd Expeditionary Fleet drifted in the gathering dark between her ships and the amber curve of Calliope Prime. 291 crippled hulls surrendering their weapons under the watchful escort of a fleet the Dominion's own intelligence apparatus had insisted, right up until the moment it stopped being able to insist anything at all, simply did not exist. I don't imagine you will. The formal surrender took 4 hours to complete, human boarding teams moving methodically through the surviving Dominion hulls to verify weapons stand-down. Their presence aboard ships 4 times their own vessels' displacement, a strange, quiet coda to a battle that had 13 minutes earlier, seemed to promise humanity's annihilation rather th. And its unlikely triumph. Threxin Vaol stood on the ruined bridge of his flagship and watched it happen, and somewhere in the long, silent hours of that watching, the address he had once composed in his head, the one about inevitability, about the river and the mountain, about the particular grace with which the Dominion permitted the conquered to yield, dissolved entirely, replaced by nothing at all, because he found he no longer had any words prepared for the version of this story he was actually going to have to tell. Word of what happened at Kepler-Verdance reached the Dominion's core worlds 41 days later, carried by the crippled remnant of the Third Expeditionary Fleet limping home under its own reduced power. Its weapons stripped, its crew diminished, its fleet marshal a changed man delivering a report that the Cortex's censors initially refused to believe had not been corrupted in transit. It reached the Thren expanse not long after, whispered first and then spoken openly among client species who had spent decades quietly wondering whether the Dominion's aura of inevitability was as absolute as its propaganda insisted, and who now, for the first time in living memory, had concrete evidence that it was not. And it reached, eventually, every corner of a galaxy that had spent 11,000 years organizing itself around the assumption that the Valorian Dominion did not lose. A single, quiet, thoroughly documented data point that suggested the universe's oldest empire had finally met a species patient enough, disciplined enough, and quietly ruthless enough to turn the Dominion's own certainty into the weapon that broke it. Humanity did not conquer the Valorian Dominion that day. It did something in the long run considerably more dangerous to an empire built on 11,000 years of unbroken myth. It proved, in front of the widest possible audience, that the myth could be broken at all. And in the years that followed, as the story of Kepler-Verdant spread from system to system, growing in the telling the way all such stories do, humanity's reputation transformed with a speed that outpaced even its own colonial expansion, from a scattered, struggling, barely noticed Class 5 minimal threat, tolerated at the margins of a galaxy far older and far more powerful than itself, into something else entirely. Not yet an empire, not yet a power the old civilizations openly feared. But something new, something that every species who heard the full account of that battle, the disguised platforms, the hidden fleet, the nuclear-pumped lasers, the 6 years of patient, invisible preparation behind a false face of harmless agricultural charm, filed away with a particular, careful attention they had never before thought to give the youngest starfaring species in the galaxy. A species that had learned, in the space of a single afternoon above a quiet colony world, that being underestimated was not a weakness to overcome but a weapon to be sharpened, patiently, deliberately, for exactly as long as it took. Outcasts once. Overlords perhaps in the fullness of time still to come. But in the immediate aftermath of Kepler-Verdant's, humanity had become something the galaxy's oldest and proudest empire had never once expected to find among the stars it thought it already understood completely. A question nobody was certain any longer how to answer, and an enemy nobody in their right mind would ever again dismiss without looking twice.